The church went so quiet she could hear the candles. 43 people in the pews of the Copper Falls Church on a Saturday in October of 1881, and not one of them making a sound. And Mara Finch standing at the altar in her good gray dress, with her hands folded in front of her, and the minister looking at her as though she had just set fire to something he was responsible for. She had not planned to say it. She had planned to say nothing, had planned it since the moment the arrangement was made, had practiced the silence the way you practice a difficult piece of music, in the dark, alone, until it sits in the body as something almost natural. The advertisement had not asked. The letters had not asked. The man standing across from her at the altar had not asked, and she had told herself that what was not asked did not need answering, and she had almost believed it until the minister said the words about issue and increase and the giving of children, and they almost collapsed entirely. "I cannot," she said, into the words, into the silence after the words. "I cannot have children. I should have said so. I am sorry. I wanted you to know before it was done." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, in the even, unhurried voice she had learned through 4 letters and 1 brief meeting, "Good. Less waiting." He said it quietly enough that the front row heard it, and the back rows did not. And then he looked at the minister and nodded, and the minister continued. The 43 people in the pews did not understand what they had heard. Neither did she. But the ceremony finished, and she became his wife. And good, less waiting was the thing she carried out of that church into the October afternoon, turning it in her hands the way you turn a thing whose purpose you have not yet determined, but which you are certain has one. If this story already has you, subscribe to this channel right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me, because what Jesse Holt meant when he said those 4 words is going to take this whole story to understand, and it is worth every word of the understanding. She had been barren since she was 24, from the particular unhelpful variety of bodily fact that the doctors had described in language that amounted to, "The capacity is not present. There is no remedy." She was 32 years old when she stood at the altar in Copper Falls. She had spent 8 years carrying the knowledge the way you carry something that does not diminish with time. Not heavier, precisely, but more settled, more fully incorporated into the structure of things, until it was less a wound than a fact, like the color of her hair or the width of her hands. She was a large woman, broad across the back, full in the figure, with the kind of capable, unpretty hands that people noticed, and then stopped noticing once she used them for anything, which she frequently did. She had been keeping house for her widowed uncle in Billings for 3 years when the advertisement appeared in the Helena Gazette, rancher, Copper Falls, Montana Territory. Seeks wife. No young women. No nonsense. No particular requirement except honesty and the willingness to stay. J. Holt. She had read No Young Women and set the paper down. She had picked it up again. She had read it twice more and written her reply the same night. Because she was, at 32, a woman who had finished waiting for the right moment and had decided that the right moment was the one currently available. His letters were spare and direct, every word having been auditioned, and a number not making the final selection. He described the ranch without sentiment, 1,200 acres, adequate house, solvent operation, 1 hired man who was reliable, and 1 dog who was not. He described himself with a brevity that told her almost nothing, and, by the quality of its omissions, told her rather more. I am 41 years old. I have been alone for some time. I do not find it suits me as well as I expected. She had not told him about the barrenness in the letters. She had written the sentence 4 times across 4 drafts and deleted it each time, and had argued with herself about this on 12 separate occasions between March and October, and had not resolved the argument so much as been overtaken by the wedding date. Arriving at the altar with the weight of it sitting in her chest like a stone she had promised herself she would put down and had not. She had put it down at the altar. Without planning to, because the minister had said the words about children, and the stone had become too heavy to hold. The wagon road to the Holt Ranch was 14 miles, and she rode it beside him in the October afternoon with a silence between them that was, she had gathered in their one prior meeting, his version of thought. She was working through it too. "You meant what you said," she said, eventually at the altar. "I meant it," he said. "I don't know what you meant," she said. He looked at the road. "I'll show you," he said. "It'll take some time. I have time." She said. "Yes," he said. "That's the idea." She looked at the mountains and she thought about that's the idea and what it might mean, and she could not yet determine it, and she filed it beside good, less waiting in the interior place where she kept things she intended to return to. The Holt Ranch was well ordered in the way of a property whose owner had solved most of the solvable problems. The barn was tight, the fences sound, the kitchen stocked with the austere practicality of a man who feeds himself adequately and without ceremony. The house was clean in the way of a man who keeps the surfaces he uses and has made his peace with the surfaces he does not. She put the larder in order on her second morning, because she could not think inside disorder, and she was thinking hard. The bedroom had a wedding photograph on the shelf, his first wife, a small woman with fair hair and a composed expression, dead 11 years. The photograph had been dusted recently and placed with care, and she looked at it a moment and left it exactly where it was. The accounts which Jessie showed her without being asked on the third day were current but organized in a system impenetrable to anyone else. She reorganized them into a ledger anyone could read and left it on the desk without mentioning it. When Jessie found it, he stood there a long moment and said nothing, which was, she was learning, his most expressive register. She cooked. The kitchen was the room she thought in, and she thought best when her hands were occupied, bread rising by 6, the stove properly hot, the coffee strong. On the 4th morning he stopped in the doorway and said, "That smells like," and stopped. "My mother made bread that smelled like that," he said. "Salt and rosemary," she said. "You had rosemary in the kitchen garden, 3rd bed from the fence. I cut some." He came in and sat at the table, and she gave him the bread, and he ate it and said nothing. And she saw, in the quality of the nothing, the thing she had been learning to read in him. Not nothing at all, but the particular form of full that a person produces when something has reached somewhere they did not leave unguarded. She was building, piece by piece, an understanding of what he had meant. She found the room on the 11th day. She had been working through the upper floor methodically. She was the kind of person who needed to know what was in a house before she could feel easy in it, and the room at the end of the hall was unlocked, which was not why she was surprised. She was surprised by what was in it. Books, not a shelf of books, a room of books. Floor to ceiling on 3 walls, with a reading chair in the corner and a lamp beside it, and a small table with a glass on it, as though someone had left mid-chapter. The books were organized with a rigor that contrasted with the studied casualness of every other room in the house, by subject. And within subject by a logic she could not immediately decode, but which was clearly a logic. Because Jessie Holt was a man who had a logic for everything and did not explain it until asked. She stood in the doorway for a long time. The subjects she could read from the spines: land management, cattle husbandry, weather and seasons, the natural history of Montana, mathematics, 3 volumes of general medicine, and then taking up the entire third wall. History. American history. Territorial history. The history of the frontier and the history before the frontier, and the history underneath the history that most books did not address, but some did. And on the small table beside the reading chair, face down and open to its current page, a book about the education of children. She crossed the room and picked it up and looked at it. It was not new. It had been read before. The spine was broken comfortably in the way of a book that has been opened at this particular angle many times. The pages were marked in several places with slips of paper. And she opened to one of the marked pages and read the paragraph the slip indicated. It was about teaching reading to children who arrived at school with no prior instruction, about patience and method, and the particular rewards of a student who comes to knowledge late, older than the others, more ashamed, more certain they cannot do it, and the moment when the text opens up for them, which the author described as the most reliable joy available in a schoolroom, or perhaps anywhere. She set the book down carefully. She looked at the room. She sat in the reading chair for a while, in the particular stillness of a person who has picked up a piece of information that has changed the shape of what they were looking at. And she looked at the 3 walls of books, and the lamp, and the glass, and the careful organization of a man who spent his evenings in this room, alone for 11 years. And she began, slowly, the way understanding comes when it has a lot of ground to cover, to understand what he had been waiting for. She went downstairs. She sat across from him at supper, and she looked at him the way she had been looking at him since October, with the specific, systematic attention she brought to things she needed to know. And she said, "The room at the end of the hall." He looked at his plate, then at her. "I meant to show you that," he said. "I wasn't ready yet." "Ready for what?" she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was choosing. "I taught myself to read," he said, "when I was 27 years old. I couldn't before that. I managed the ranch for 12 years without being able to read. I had methods, systems, ways of getting the information I needed that didn't require reading it." He looked at the window. "My first wife taught me. It took 2 years. She was patient in a way I don't think I deserved. She was very still. When she died," he said, "I kept reading. It was the thing she had given me and I didn't want to. I kept going." He paused. "I've been reading for 11 years. I've read most of what's in that room. And for a long time I have wanted to give that to someone, the way she gave it to me. Not to a child of my own, necessarily, to anyone who needed it. Anyone who came to it late and thought they couldn't." He looked at her hands on the table. "I wrote no young women because young women come wanting families," he said. "And I don't have a family to give. What I have is that room, and the ranch, and the time." He met her eyes. "When you said what you said at the altar about not being able to have children, I thought, there it is. We can stop waiting. There's the whole of it." The fire worked in the stove. Mara Finch Holt looked at the man across the table from her, and she thought about the stone she had put down at the altar, and where it had landed, and what it had turned out to be. "Less waiting," she said. "Yes," he said. "You want to teach," she said. "I want us to teach," he said. "Whatever children come to us. Cord's grandchildren, there are 4 of them. The oldest one can't read and is ashamed of it and thinks I don't know. The families on the North Ridge who can't get to the school in town. Anyone," he looked at his hands. "I have the room. I have the time. I needed someone who also has the time, who isn't spending it on something else." She thought about 8 years of carrying a fact that she had assumed was a subtraction. A deficit. The thing she could not provide. The thing that rendered her insufficient for a particular purpose. She thought about a man who had written no young women and no particular requirement except honesty, and who had built a room of books and filled it over 11 years with the patient, methodical love of someone who had received a gift and was waiting to pass it on. "I was a teacher," she said, "before my uncle needed me. 6 years." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "You mentioned it in your second letter." That's when I answered the same day. The difficulty arrived in the form of Mrs. Aldred, who was the wife of the Copper Falls land agent and the self-appointed recorder of the town's social arrangements, and who had been in the front left pew at the wedding and had heard good, less waiting, and had spent the subsequent 3 weeks constructing an interpretation of those 4 words that was both entirely wrong and in the way of entirely wrong interpretations. Very difficult to dislodge. What she had decided they meant was that Jesse Holt had been told his wife was barren and had responded with the casual cruelty of a man who had never wanted children and was glad to be relieved of the pretense. That the marriage was a convenience. That Mara Finch had been, the word Mrs. Aldred used in private, repeated in public, was used, which was the word that carried the fullest freight of her disapproval and spread the furthest through the town of Copper Falls in the 3 weeks following the wedding. She came to the ranch on a Tuesday in November with her daughter-in-law, as was apparently the custom. Mara answered the door. She knew before Mrs. Aldred said a word that the visit was the kind that conceals its purpose in social form, and she let the form play out. Tea, the kitchen, the examination of the shelves, and when Mrs. Aldred had arrived at what she had come to say, which was a version of, the town was concerned about the nature of the arrangement, and whether Mara had fully understood what she had entered into. Mara looked at her with the expression she had developed at 32 for exactly this species of charitable condescension. "I understood completely," she said. "I made the confession at the altar of my own will." He responded, as he chose. We proceeded. She refilled Mrs. Aldred's tea. "If the town's concern is for my welfare, I would suggest directing it toward the 4 children on the North Ridge who cannot read and whose parents cannot get them to the school in town. My husband and I are addressing that. Any assistance from the Ladies' Society would be welcome." "Mrs. Aldred said, the children on the North Ridge." "The Garrity children and young Cord Purcell," Mara said. "We're beginning Thursday. Jesse has the books. I have the method. If you know of others, I would be glad of the names." Mrs. Aldred looked at the daughter-in-law. "I have a nephew," the daughter-in-law said, slightly ahead of her better judgment, who is 9 and cannot manage his letters. "Thursday," Mara said. 2 o'clock. "You're welcome to bring him." The first class was 6 children. The second was 9. By January it was 14, ranging in age from 6 to 13, seated on benches in the reading room at the end of the hall, because Jesse had carried the benches up from the barn the week before, without being asked. 3 trips on a cold morning, and had set them in rows and stood back, and looked at the room that had been waiting for 11 years, and said nothing, and then gone back to the cattle. She taught. She taught the way she had been taught to teach in Ohio, and the way she had developed in 6 years of practice. With patience and method, and the particular attention to shame that was required when a child had come to believe they could not do a thing. She taught as though there were nothing remarkable about a 32-year-old woman teaching reading in a rancher's private library in Copper Falls, Montana, which there was not, in her assessment. And the children gradually came to share her assessment. Because children take their cues from the adults in the room, and she was the most certain adult they had encountered on this particular subject. Jessie came in, sometimes in the afternoons, not to observe, but to tend the stove, or carry water, or sit for a moment on the bench at the back, with the quality of a man who has been shown something he was not certain he would ever see, and is taking his time with it. The children accepted his presence the way children accept the presence of a large, quiet man who keeps the fire going and does not interrupt the lesson. As part of the furniture, which was the highest compliment available from a room full of children who were learning to read, Cord's eldest grandchild, a boy of 15 named Thomas, who had believed since he was 9 that he could not do it, and had built considerable defensive architecture around that belief, broke through in the 5th week. She was working with him on a Tuesday afternoon after the other children had gone, at the table in the reading room, and she heard the shift in his reading. The way the words stopped being sounds he was identifying one at a time and became a current he was moving through. The meaning arriving before the labor, the text opening up in the way the book had described, and she said nothing, because making much of it could unmake it, and they read for another 20 minutes before she told him he could go, and he went. And she sat in the reading room in the quiet and felt what the author of the book had called the most reliable joy available in a schoolroom, or perhaps anywhere. She heard the stove door close in the hall. Jessie had been in the house. She didn't know how long he had been listening. She didn't need to know. The school board came in March. 3 men from Copper Falls who had heard, through Mrs. Aldred's network and despite Mrs. Aldred's original intentions, about the teaching at the Holt Ranch, and who had a proposal. The county school teacher had left in December. The schoolhouse in Copper Falls had been empty for 4 months. The board was authorized to offer a salary and a formal appointment to a qualified teacher, and Mara Holt was, by their understanding, qualified. They sat at the kitchen table and put the proposal forward. Mara looked at Jessie across the table. He looked at her with the expression she had learned over 4 months, the one that was not practiced and not performed, and that meant, in the language she had been developing since October, exactly what it appeared to mean. "The ranch is 11 miles from town," she said to the board. "We had considered that," said the chairman. "We wondered whether the school might come to you, for now, while the building in town is repaired. There are 14 children already accustomed to the room." She looked at her hands on the table. "I'll need the proper books," she said. "A set for each child, and the county map of families who aren't sending their children to school, and the reasons why." The chairman said, "The reasons why. Distance, usually, shame, sometimes, work requirements. I'd like the list." She looked at him. "And I'll need my husband's involvement. He is a better teacher of mathematics than I am, and his history is considerable." Jessie looked at the table. "I don't have a qualification," he said. "You have a room full of books and 11 years of reading them," she said. "The children don't require a certificate. They require someone who knows the material and finds it worth knowing." She heard his breath change. The particular small sound of a man who has been offered a thing he did not know he was waiting to be offered. The board left with an agreement. 14 children became 23 by April. Thomas Cord, who had believed since he was 9 that he could not, was reading history by May. In June, on the front porch of the Holt Ranch, on a warm evening when the mountains were the particular blue they go in June, when the light is long and level, Jessie Holt sat beside his wife and looked at the valley and said, "When I said it at the altar, what you thought I meant." "I thought you meant you didn't want children," she said. "That it was a relief, a convenience." "I know," he said. "I thought it for about 4 days," she said. "And then," he said. "And then I found the room," she said. He was quiet for a while in the way that she had stopped being uncertain about. She knew what was in the quiet now. She had learned it the way she had learned everything, by paying full attention, over time, until it was known. "My first wife," he said. "She taught me to read. And when she died, I thought, all that time she spent on me, and now I'm the only one who has it. It seemed like the wrong end for all that patience." He looked at the valley. "I wanted to put it somewhere, pass it on. I'd been waiting 11 years to find someone to do that with." She looked at the mountains. "Less waiting," she said. "Yes," he said. "You were right on time." She turned and looked at him. He looked back. The long June light came across the porch and laid itself on the boards, and the two of them sat in it, unhurried, the way people sit when they have stopped waiting for what is already here. The 43 people who had been in the church at Copper Falls on that October Saturday had heard 4 words and understood none of them. By June they understood all 4, though understanding had arrived differently for each of them. For some in March when the school board came back with an agreement. For some in January when Thomas Cord began reading history. For some in November when Mrs. Aldred's daughter-in-law brought a 9-year-old boy to the ranch on a Thursday at 2 o'clock and came back 3 weeks later with the news that he was managing his letters. For Mrs. Aldred herself, it arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in April in the reading room of the Holt Ranch when she came to discuss an administrative matter with Mara and found the door to the end room open and 14 children at their benches, and Jesse Holt at the back of the room, and a boy of 15 reading aloud from a history of the Montana Territory in the voice of someone who has, without quite knowing when it happened, become a person who reads. She stood in the doorway for some time. Then she went downstairs and she sat at the kitchen table and she waited for Mara to come in, and when Mara came in she said, "I owe you an apology." Mara poured the tea. "You owe me nothing," she said. "You brought us a boy who can read now. That's sufficient." Mrs. Aldred sat with her tea. "Good," she said after a while. "Less waiting." She said it quietly, in a tone that was not mockery, but something closer to the thing it takes some people longer than others to arrive at, the understanding that they heard something true and did not know it until the truth had had time to show itself. Mara looked at her for a moment. Then she sat down. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that."